Oops, he did it again? Yet another boat off the coast of Venezuela has been bombed by the president. Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the resident legal diva, and this is The Breakdown. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Legal AF for all the news and drama coming out of this administration. So we're still reeling from the bombing of a boat off the waters of Venezuela that killed 11 people. We found out now that that boat was actually turning around and was not an actual direct threat to the U.S. because of the fact that it was no longer headed towards U.S. shores. We also learned that that particular boat had been bombed multiple times to ensure that there were no survivors. I think we've now gotten into the realm of war crimes. Because again, the president has the power to act if there's a direct threat to our shores. There was no direct threat. And now on top of that, another boat off the coast of Venezuela has been bombed, killing 3 people. And in this particular instance, the president was like, well, look, you could see the evidence. There was tons of cocaine and fentanyl floating in the water. Meanwhile, we look at the footage and we see no such thing. Nobody has said, oh yeah, I looked at that photo because I'm looking at it. I couldn't see it. Nobody else seemed to be able to see it. So again, as a former prosecutor, in order to put together a case, you need evidence. So on top of the 2 bombings, there was a third incident, and I'm going to tie this together in a moment. So give me a second here. But there was another incident over the weekend where a fishing boat was boarded by about 18 U.S. military personnel, again, under the auspices of looking for narcotics, et cetera, et cetera. Well, turns out no narcotics were found, but that is consistent with what the protocol is in terms of dealing with vessels that may or may not be bringing in contraband. You board the vessel, you search it, you look for evidence, you take pictures, you document, and then you take people in custody if a crime has been committed. When you're blowing up boats willy-nilly, the evidence goes up with it. So if you wanted to actually make a case and prosecute people, or at least turn around to President Maduro and be like, the proof's in the pudding, see, you've been trafficking like crazy. Well, that evidence is now sitting at the bottom of the ocean. So that's leading me to believe that this is not the goal. It's leading me to believe that the next goal is an invasion of Venezuela, or at the very least, an escalation of what's happening in the Caribbean Sea. And to back up my claim is the president also said that U.S. military strikes targeting alleged drug smugglers at sea could be expanded to land. Whose land is he talking about? Obviously, he's talking about Venezuela. Obviously, he's talking about missile strikes on a sovereign nation. Now, politics aside, let's look at the humanitarian aspect of this, because missiles can miss. So this means innocent civilians may end up getting killed as a result of this president's quote unquote war on drugs, which again, I call sus on that. That's real suspect to me. Again, from the standpoint of if you're really trying to dismantle drug gangs, killing people is not the way to do it. Putting people in prison is. Exposing the people who are doing these crimes for what they are. That's the pathway. That's what we do in an organized society. That's what we do in a democracy. But clearly, this president is not interested in that. Now, we're getting pushback on both sides with regards to the actions that the president has taken. So Senator Rand Paul, who is a Republican out of Kentucky, has taken aim at the president's administration for glorifying the killing of people without trial, saying that the lethal strike was a breach of long accepted rules of engagement. He also disclosed that this was a drone attack, which is something that the Pentagon and the Secretary of War, that's a whole other thing, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth have refused to own up to. And Senator Paul said something very interesting. He said that he didn't oppose the use of drones in war, but he objected to summarily killing people without due process. He says, during my time in the Senate, I have been the foremost critic of drones being used on civilians, especially Americans, and he's a member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. The recent drone attack on a small speedboat over 2,000 miles from our shore, without identification of the occupants or the content of the boat, is in no way part of a declared war and defies our long-standing Coast Guard rules of engagement, which include warnings to halt, non-lethal force to capture, and ultimately lethal force in self-defense or in cases of resistance. So why can't we, that process isn't broken, right? That process isn't broken. It works quite effectively. Why can't we do that? Secretary of State Marco Rubio said as much. He said that instead of blowing up the boats, troops could have gone on board and could have searched. Coast Guard could have searched. They decided not to do that. So Venezuela obviously has much to say about this because, again, these are their citizens that are, being killed. And the vice president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, said in a very detailed rebuttal, she came with the receipts from reports from the United Nations and from our own DEA, insisting Venezuela has absolutely nothing to do with the deaths of U.S. citizens from drug overdoses. She said her country is not relevant in global drug production and said that the U.S. government should be redirecting its deployed maritime forces in the Caribbean to the Pacific, where speedboats and container ships have, she said, long carried Colombian cocaine, which, again, we know Colombian cocaine is popular, and that would be the main logical target versus going after, fishing boats in the Caribbean Sea? On top of that, President Maduro stated in a press conference this week that the current administration is using drug trafficking accusations as an excuse for a military operation whose intentions are to intimidate and seek regime change in the South American country. So the reality is, this administration has been targeting President Maduro for a long time. Now, am I saying he's a great guy? No. But at the end of the day, there's a thing called due process. And if you believe that he's truly a narco-terrorist, bring him to trial. That's what we did with Noriega. You could do the same thing. Rather than trying to bomb random boats in the sea and then now trying to work your way into a justification for bombing a sovereign nation. And let's not get it twisted. Remember, this is being done without the authorization of Congress. And this is a huge problem. So, continuing with what President Maduro said in response to these strikes, he also referenced the operation where 18 Marines boarded a Venezuelan fishing boat in the Caribbean and raided it. And so he says, what were they looking for? Tuna? What were they looking for? A kilo of snapper? Who gave the order in Washington for a missile destroyer to send 18 armed Marines to raid a tuna fishing vessel? They were looking for a military incident. If the tuna fishing boys had any kind of weapons and used weapons while in Venezuelan jurisdiction, it would have been the military incident that the warmongers extremists who want a war in the Caribbean are seeking. Again, a broken clock could be right twice a day. At the end of the day, why are we trying to mess with the sovereignty of Venezuela? We've got our own problems here. And again, if there was evidence of drug trafficking, take it to court. That's why we have courts. That's the purpose of it. So going back to the pushback that we're seeing from both sides, we're now seeing some activity in Congress around basically reclaiming their powers. Because again, Congress is the only one who can declare war. So last week, Rep. Ilhan Omar, who's a Democrat out of Minnesota, introduced a new war powers resolution seeking to stop the presidential administration from conducting future strikes in the Caribbean after this attack on the first fishing boat. Now there's much more to add to it, but at the time it was only about the first fishing vessel. And the resolution states that Congress has not declared war or enacted an authorization for use of military force against Venezuela or any transnational criminal organizations designated as terrorists since February. The measure will also direct the president to end the use of U.S. armed forces against Venezuela or any transnational criminal groups designated as terrorists without the authorization of Congress. So let's see if there ends up being any traction here. Representative Schiff also chimed in saying that he was going to support a war powers resolution around this issue. But this is getting very disturbing. That one line when he said that he can expand this to land, he's about to have us in a war. He's about to have us in a war. Just your daily reminder that elections have consequences. I'm Melba Pearson, otherwise known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this was The Breakdown. Take care.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.